Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. I'm your host for tonight's program. I'm one of your average county supervisors over here in Johnson County, a county that represents the cities of Solon and North Liberty and Hills and Tiffin, and of course Iowa City and Coralville. Iowa News and Views is a statewide community affairs program organized by volunteers to present topics and information that frankly need more attention in our state. This is a weekly program. If you're watching it, for example, in Des Moines on Thursday night, we're on every week. And we are also producing a brand new show every other week. And so for 2 weeks you'll see the same show and then a new show. I'd like to thank our sponsors in the local communities that are making this show possible. I'd like to thank our volunteer crew and of course those people that have contributed to make this show possible. This public access provider is not responsible for the content of this program. I'm responsible for what I say, and of course our guests are responsible for what they say. Like you, I'll probably agree with some of the things said on this show, and I'll probably disagree with some of the things said on the show, but I leave it up to you to decide what you think about the content that we're going to present this evening. Tonight's show, we're going to be discussing legislation and attempts in Iowa to develop a parental notification law, a topic that's drawn some interest in the last couple of years here in our state. We have two guests with us, Marilyn Cohen, Executive Director of the Emma Goldman Clinic for Women in Iowa City, and we're pleased to have her here, as well as Mark Lambert, the staff attorney for Planned Parenthood of Greater Iowa, and Mark is joining us from Des Moines tonight. Mark, I've got a question to kick off for you. Could you give us a little background on the history of the legislation to date on parental notification, where we're at?
Sure thing, Joe. Last year, the Iowa legislature passed a parental notification law that would require that a provider of abortion services notify the parents or another specified adult relative of a minor who was seeking to have an abortion. The law required that the notice be provided 48 hours in advance of the abortion, and then it provided a judicial bypass option for a minor who felt she could not tell her parents and could go to court and get a judge's approval to not tell her parents. Planned Parenthood opposed that legislation. I know Emma Goldman opposed that legislation, as did other pro-choice organizations in Iowa. And unfortunately, the legislation passed. Some legislators viewed it as a compromise. In fact, many pro-choice legislators voted for it because they thought if they didn't vote for this, we'd end up with an even worse law. Mm-hmm. The law was passed last legislative session. It was slated to go into effect July 1st of 1997. But in late November, after the administrative rules had been promulgated by the health department, and both of our organizations started seriously looking at how we were going to implement this law, we decided that it was impossible, and our legal advisors advised us that the law was probably unconstitutional. So Emma Goldman Clinic for Women and Planned Parenthood of Greater Iowa teamed up along with one physician from each clinic and sued the state of Iowa and obtained an injunction, a temporary restraining order first, and then later a longer-term injunction keeping the parental notification law from going into effect.
I see. And how many teenagers does this legislation affect, Marilyn? There's a lot of discussion, a lot of activity going on. What's the situation in terms of abortions in Iowa for teenagers?
Well, and there's kind of two answers to that in terms of the actual number of teens seeking abortion services in Iowa, which the information that Planned Parenthood and Emma presented in their legal information was the number of approximately 600 teens. But a real key piece of that information is that the majority of teens, and I believe both clinics say approximately 60%, already do involve their parents in the decision. Then there would be other teens who would be in a situation with abuse or neglect, situations that everyone agrees with the fact that it's prudent that their parents not be told. So then what you're really looking at is creating legislation for truly a very small number of teens who don't fit either category. And we both think that in addition to the actual questions with the law, that the Iowa legislature should be spending their time doing activities that would enhance services for women.
I see. Mark, who are the main proponents of this legislation here in our state?
The people pushing this legislation have been really the anti-choice community, the so-called pro-life community, and those anti-choice legislators and anti-choice lobbyists have been the ones really pushing this legislation. It's not coming out of a sense of this is something, a law that we need in this state because it's a good idea. It's really, the impetus behind it is truly a political move by the anti-choice movement.
Well, it sounds so reasonable. Teenagers telling their parents that they're going to have an abortion. Don't you think parents should be involved in these kinds of decisions?
Well, it sounds reasonable in the abstract, but what we really need to keep focused on is the lives of individual young women. And so you cannot mandate a good communication process between parents and teenagers. And so if it hasn't existed before now, legislation is not going to create it. It's not going to enhance troubled relationships, and we don't believe that it really serves any good purpose.
I know that both of your organizations provide health care to women. What are some of the negative consequences of this? And maybe you could elaborate about what your organizations do. Mark, do you want to take that?
Sure. Planned Parenthood of Greater Iowa is an organization that provides family planning services. We have 16 clinics throughout the state, and we provide those services, including abortion services in Des Moines and Iowa City. And our goal is to provide services to help prevent unintended pregnancies, to stop the spread of sexually transmitted infections, and to help people plan their families. And the problem with this legislation is that it interferes with the ability of some minors to have access to a safe and legal abortion because of the fear that their parents are going to be notified. We've seen it often where minors have come to us and where they just feel they can't tell their parents. And I think the negative consequences of this legislation will be that we'll see minors going into other states. For example, Illinois does not have a parental notification law in effect right now. We'll see minors traveling great distances to avoid telling their parents, and I think that's dangerous.
Well, Emma Goldman is a feminist women's health clinic, so we provide many of the same services that Planned Parenthood does in terms of medical services and education services. And what is really important for me to say is that as pro-choice organizations, we really believe that women deserve information. And so both organizations provide the information that helps the woman who is in the situation of an unplanned pregnancy to have the information and to then be able to make the decision herself. And we feel that the best person to make the decision is that woman.
Very good. What are some of the reasons that teens would be unwilling to tell their parents about the need for an abortion?
You know, I think it's really interesting that some teens would be not wanting to tell their parents, not out of that troubled relationship, but because they fear disappointing their parents. These are the teens who are on the honor roll, or play the sports, etc., and they are very fearful of disappointing their parents. That's one scenario. That's not the only scenario, of course.
And other teens come from an abusive household or a dysfunctional family. There are cases where there are emancipated minors who don't live with their parents, haven't spoken to their parents in years. This law makes no exception for them, except for going through the judicial bypass.
Okay.
Again, minors will be those who feel they can't tell their parents may indeed seek desperate measures in order to avoid telling their parents.
I think it's really interesting in the case of a young woman who's already had a child, she can sign for her child's health care, but in this instance she would not be able to make this decision her own self. That's another instance.
Well, I was recently reading that teenagers don't have to have a parent's consent to have a child. It seems like a bit of an irony here. That seems like a pretty important decision as well, that we wouldn't want, to be talking about the same kind of interest on that very question. Mark, you mentioned judicial bypass. What does that entail? What's that about? And will that be part of the new legislation?
Yeah, in fact, it has to be part of the legislation in order for that legislation to be constitutional. Judicial bypass means that the state has to, if they have a parental notification law, they have to create a system where the minor can go to court, get the judge's permission to not notify her parents. Of course, with a minor in a desperate situation, that is a horribly cruel thing to force her to go through. If any of the viewers out there have been to court, or if you've been to court, you know it's this very intimidating and scary process, and we're going to be forcing these minors who are in a very bad situation to go through that process and go to court. And but that has to be in the law in order for it to be constitutional.
I see. I see. And Mark, what is the current status of the law today? We're taping this on February 24th, and it'll start airing a week from today around the state.
Possibly the week that this show airs, or the following week, the Iowa House will likely be considering legislation that is intended to fix the problems that the federal judge found with the law. But beyond that, and I might add, I don't think it fixes all those problems, but beyond that, there is an attempt in this legislation to strip out the ability of a minor to notify, to choose to have a aunt or uncle or grandparent notified. Right. We are working hard, even though we're opposing the legislation and we oppose parental notification laws, we're working hard to try to keep that in that ability for the minor to notify another adult relative in there, so that the minor has the maximum flexibility.
It sounds like the flavor of this is turned fairly punitive where women are concerned. What's your sense about that in terms of this new legislative attempt?
Well, I think it's reflective of a conservative agenda that has its anti-choice perspective, and that part of that is reduction of the rights of women to access a constitutional service. And I think that that is accurate. You see it showing up in other ways as well.
The anti-choice movement has figured out that they're not going to get Roe v. Wade overturned. They're not going to be able to outlaw abortion or get a constitutional amendment passed. So they've resorted to a new strategy of chipping away at abortion rights in any way they can. First, we'll see parental notification. We're seeing a statistical reporting bill. We'll see other late-term abortion legislation will probably be coming next year. These are all attempts to simply chip away and to reduce the number of abortions by attacking it from the periphery.
That's very interesting. You're watching Iowa News and Views. Our guests this evening are Mark Lambert, staff attorney for Planned Parenthood of Greater Iowa, and Marilyn Cohen, the executive director of the Emma Goldman Clinic. We're going to be back in just a second to find out what the pro-choice community in the state of Iowa is doing about the issue of parental notification. I'm the host of Iowa News and Views. I want to tell you a little bit about an internet discussion forum that we're organizing in regards to the show, and it's called the iNews Discussion Forum. And I've got a graphic here today. It's a pretty expensive graphic made on poster board, of course, and it describes our internet discussion forum. And what's going on here is we have somebody in Sioux City that has sent a message on his computer through email to our main computer at the headquarters, wherever that is, and then that message goes out across the state to other viewers who are also on our discussion forum, and then they can respond to this message. And what we'd like to do with the email discussion forum is to generate discussion about the topics on the show and other community and state issues of interest to our viewers. And so join us. The address for the internet discussion group, if you send us an email message to i-news@pobox.com, we'll sign you up and send you some details about how the list works and how you can become more involved in our effort here. We will also be giving the address at the end of the show, so if you didn't get it now, get a pencil and a paper and we'll bring it back to you. As part of that, one of our local sponsors, Dennis Harbaugh in Waterloo, has recently had an opinion editorial piece about competitiveness in the Des Moines Register. We hope to have that on our web page in the next couple of days here, so you can learn about what Dennis is saying about competitiveness in Iowa, and we'll give you that at the end of the show. This is Iowa News and Views. I'm Joe Balcom. We just had a short commercial break to tell you about our internet discussion forum. I hope you'll check it out and send us an email note so we can connect with you. Back to our topic, parental notification in Iowa. Mark, I've heard some people say, parents in particular, that I want my child to tell me when they have their ear pierced. Why not when they have an abortion?
That's an interesting argument, and one we hear a lot. People should realize that there is not a state law that requires that the ear piercing company notify parents, or that the minor has to have parental permission to get her ears pierced, or that the other one I hear a lot is that the school can't give my daughter an aspirin without my permission. Again, there's no state law setting forth that a minor has to go to has to have her parents notified or get her parents' permission before taking that aspirin. In those situations, the insurance companies that represent those, either the school or the ear piercer, has told them, look, to sort of protect yourself from liability, you ought to require the minors to get parental notification. It's purely a business decision that has been made in order to protect them from a perceived liability. So there's no law requiring in all those situations that parents be notified or that parental permission be acquired. So really, this is unique in the area of abortion to require a parental notification or parental permission. It is. It's not done in other areas, and you know, it's truly a unique thing. So that's an interesting argument that people make, but the reality is that there are no state laws requiring all those kinds of parental permission or consent.
I see. Marilyn, how has the pro-choice community in our state responded to this debate around parental notification?
I think overall around choice issues, the pro-choice community is somewhat complacent. Roe is the law of the land, and in Iowa they have felt relatively comfortable. So now they are being more alerted to the fact that they would need to speak or write to their legislature around all issues affecting choice. Specifically around parental notification, these days we are asking that pro-choice people contact their legislators regarding keeping in the expanded definition of family. Kind of a little joke that I make says that even the Brady Bunch is blended family, and that the language in the bill is really reflective more of Iowa's families than the typical mother-father nuclear family that all our families were like that as far as close family communications, et cetera, but we need to recognize the reality of some of Iowa's families.
You bet.
And in a situation, Joe, where the minor has decided that she is not going to tell her parents, she cannot, she will not. If the law does not provide her an opportunity to choose another adult relative to be notified, then her option is to go in front of a total stranger, a judge. So it's really not a choice between the parents being notified or an aunt, uncle, or grandparent being notified. It's a choice between, is that minor going to go in front of a stranger, a judge, to get permission to proceed with the abortion without the notification, or is she going to be able to go to a family member?
I see.
That's the real issue. And I agree, the pro-choice community really needs to communicate with their Iowa legislators and let them know how they feel about this issue, and encourage them to, of course, oppose parental notification altogether. But if we are going to have a law, it needs to be as flexible as possible to allow those minors who are in not the perfect family situation to have some options.
My next question was, how can people get involved? And I think you just responded to that. In addition to the pro-choice community, Iowans in general that are interested in this topic could certainly make their views known. Let's shift gears from the state legislature to the Quad Cities. I've been following in the paper some resistance in the Quad Cities to actually both of your organizations' attempts to set up women's health clinics. Marilyn, you could start out, and Mark, you can take a hit at this too. What's going on in the Quad Cities? Why so much resistance?
Well, it was about 2 years ago that both organizations announced their intentions of going to the Quad City communities. We were invited in there. There are women and families who need and want our services there, and so both organizations are really wanting to open clinics there and provide these services. And over the months we have encountered a variety of strategies that the end result is 2 years later we're not there. I certainly want Mark, who Planned Parenthood has occupied a prime place in front page of Quad City Times, to have a little time here.
Sure.
Yeah, and you know, we've seen everything from the Davenport City Council passing several ordinances in order to keep our organizations, our clinics out of Davenport. Right now, Planned Parenthood is attempting to open a clinic. We found a site we'd like to construct our clinic on in Bettendorf, and we received a positive recommendation from the city planning and zoning staff, but the Planning and Zoning Commission turned us down recently, and now the issue is before the City Council coming up on March 4th, and we are putting together our presentation to make our case to the City Council that our services are needed and wanted, and we were invited to come to the Quad Cities, and that we will be good neighbors and provide good services and needed services and health services in the Quad Cities. So we're hoping that the City Council will approve our zoning request and allow us to build our clinic. Of course, you know, we've been into federal court twice over this, once against the city of Bettendorf, once against the state of Iowa that tried to subject both Emma Goldman and Planned Parenthood to this Certificate of Need program, which is has never been applied to a family planning program in the history of that state program. So
very good. Well, good luck to you both in
Thank you.
your efforts in the Quad Cities, and I appreciate you being on the show tonight. I'd like to thank our guests, Mark Lambert from Planned Parenthood of Greater Iowa and Marilyn Cohen, the Executive Director of the Emma Goldman Clinic in Iowa City. Next week's show, we'll be talking about the death penalty in Iowa and the debate surrounding the death penalty. In a second or two, we're going to give you some information about how to contact us through the mail, through the telephone, email, and of course our webpage. We'd like some feedback on that. We'd also like your ideas about the show, ideas for future shows, how we can improve it, guests that you might like to see. I'd like to thank our sponsors, of course, in the local communities that make this show possible. I'd like to thank our crew here tonight producing the show, and of course thank our viewers for tuning in. Don't forget to program those VCRs. We'll be on at the same time next week. And this is just a show, as you know, and what's really important is what you're doing in your community day in and day out to make it a better place to live and to make our state a better place to live. This has been Iowa News and Views. My name is Joe Balcom. I'm your host this evening, and thank you for joining us.